This is an India Today exclusive. I'm being joined by Hillel Neuer, who is the Executive Director of UNRWA and testified before the US Foreign Relations Committee with regards to the UNRWA expose, that's the UNRWA, and their involvement with terrorists or the Hamas in the October 7th deadly terrorist attacks. Thank you so much, Hillel, for joining us here on India Today. Let's begin with the Foreign Relations Committee where you testified. What's the situation on the ground that you explained to them, and how has this entire incident impacted and affected the credibility of UNRWA itself?
Well, UNRWA has very little credibility because for 10 years, we've been submitting to them warnings that their employees, including teachers and school principals, are inciting to jihadi terrorism, calling to slaughter Jews, and glorifying Nazi leader Adolf Hitler. And their response was not only to ignore us, to ignore the reports, to fail to take any action, but to attack us, to say that UNRWA is not credible, and so forth. So for 10 years, they've been ignoring our warnings, and for them to suddenly announce now that they've fired, 10 people or something, and they're investigating, that's too little and too late. The agency is infested with terrorism. We estimate 1,200 staff in Gaza alone are members of Hamas and Islamic Jihad terrorist organizations. That is the situation with UNRWA today.
Now, this expose, the intelligence gathering with regards to UNRWA, exposes certain staff members of UNRWA being involved with the Hamas or with the terrorist incident. But the larger picture over here about the humanitarian aid that is to reach Gaza, what really happens to that now, and how is it impacting humanitarian aid reaching civilians in Gaza?
Well, we need to find a practical replacement. UNRWA is a failure. The international community should not be paying taxes to an agency that has 1,200 terrorists working there, 6,000 family members of terrorists, and actual perpetrators of the massacre of October 7th on the staff. So that's clear. And we just need to find a replacement. There was a question asked at the United Nations last week in Geneva, and the spokesman from the World Health Organization said, and I quote, "The United Nations in general and the WHO are capable of scaling up to replace UNRWA if they are defunded." So we are working at finding alternatives. There's the UN Refugee Agency, which is for the whole world, UNHCR. They can handle the situation. They're very capable of doing so. We don't need UNRWA, a special agency, which has the opposite purpose, not to resettle refugees, but to perpetuate Palestinians in generation after generation of grievance, hatred, and war. That needs to end. We have replacements: World Food Program, OCHA, the UN Humanitarian Agency, UNDP, the Development Program, UNHCR, the Refugee Agency. All of these are very capable of filling in the space and distributing aid as much as needed.
Right, but Hillel, the UNRWA works under the United Nations, and UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres in a recent statement has asked those countries that have halted their funding for UNRWA to not do that and continue their aid operations, so to ensure that humanitarian aid really reaches those Palestinian refugees. What's your reaction and your take on that?
Well, my concern is that the Secretary General has failed to act. We sent him warnings numerous times. We've requested to meet with the heads of UNRWA and with him to discuss incitement to terrorism, the problem that is widespread and systematic throughout the agency. He failed to meet. He failed to act. His spokesman a few weeks ago said, UN Watch, referring to me, my organization, they have a track record. So they tried to disparage us. The evidence is on our website, unwatch.org. The case against UNRWA. You'll see our latest report, UNRWA's Terrorgram, documenting 3,000 UNRWA teachers in a chat group that incited to murder and celebrated the horrific acts of October 7th. Secretary General Guterres has failed to take action. It's all too little, too late. He's trying to make the problem go away. This so-called inquiry that he created is a fake inquiry. It will not uncover the truth. which is that terrorism is widespread and systematic within UNRWA.
Now, did the UN watch ahead of October 7th attacks warn the UN body, that's the world body, United Nations, of such involvement of staff members of UNRWA with certain elements within Hamas that were planning attacks in the past as well?
We have documented over the years certainly widespread incitement to jihadi terrorism, meaning teachers like Elham Mansour of UNRWA in Lebanon saying, by Allah, you need to slaughter all the Israelis and the Jews and the Zionists, and whoever doesn't do so is breaching their obligations to Allah. So we had open calls to slaughter Jews. We had Riyad Nimr, a teacher for UNRWA, who celebrated the massacre of Jewish worshipers in a synagogue in Jerusalem in 2014. Many other instances documented in reports that we sent in 2015, 3 different reports, 2017, 2019, 2021, this year in March, this year in November, 2023 rather, in March and November, and then finally in January, just a week ago, I presented to the United States Congress our report, UNRWA's Terrorgram. Each of these reports consisted of a warning to the UN that terrorism support was widespread. In addition, we know, and it emerged that UNRWA had allowed rockets to be launched from their facilities and weapons to be concealed. That is documented from the 2014 war. And finally, I would say there are UNRWA people in the years past who were part of the Hamas political bureau. One's name, I think, is Suhail Hindi, if I'm not mistaken, and UNRWA removed him. So incitement, they knew about it. Involvement of some of their staff in Hamas, they knew about it. Their facilities being used to launch rockets at Israeli civilians, each rocket being a war crime. UNRWA knew about this. They can't today pretend they didn't know. Again, we reached out to them, sent letters to Commissioner General Philippe Lazzarini, his predecessor, Philippe Krahenbuhl. They refused to meet us. They didn't want to know about it. That's the truth. UNRWA buried their heads in the sand. They cannot say they didn't know. They knew.
You testified before the Foreign Relations Committee, Neuer. What really happened there?
Well, the committee of the U.S. Congress called for a hearing on to expose UNRWA, the failures of its mission. We were there as one of the key witnesses to provide evidence. And the members of Congress, I can tell you, certainly from the chairman's side, the Republicans, but also some Democrats like Brad Schneider, Richie Torres, are outraged that more than $300 million of U.S. taxpayer money is going to fund supporters of terrorism, if not perpetrators of terrorism themselves. So the American people, I think, have had enough of this. And I think certainly the Congress is going to push the administration to cut off all the funding, not just temporarily, but for good.
But here, civilians within Gaza are being impacted, are being affected. Now, with this entire situation on the ground, what is the next step to ensure humanitarian aid reaches the people of Gaza? If not UNRWA, like you said, there are other options, but clearly, what is it that UN Watch is looking at in terms of options to ensure that aid reaches civilians in Gaza?
We have to begin the transition. The transition has to begin soon. It's not going to happen one day to the next. We have to make sure that humanitarian needs come first, but not politics, not the politics of war, the politics of revenge, the politics of hatred, incitement to terrorism. That needs to end. And UNRWA is tainted, it cannot be reformed. We've tried. It is not reformable. We need to begin the transition. World Food Program, UN Development Program, UNHCR, Office of Humanitarian Affairs, known as OCHA. All of them can do it. We're beginning discussions to begin the process of transition.
Right. Hillel, also, are there steps, next course of action that the UN Watch and other international organizations are really looking at and considering to ensure that in future, aid agencies that are working in such zones, particularly such as Gaza, that they're not involved with elements that are extremist, the terror organizations, and that there is some sort of insulation to ensure that the credibility is not lost and humanitarian aid continues?
Well, it's very hard to enforce this because Hamas is a mafia, a terrorist mafia organization, and anything in Gaza will be under their control. So every second home had underneath the children's bed grenades and weapons and RPGs. So every home was subverted. You can assume every facility, every school, every clinic will be subverted by Hamas. That is a challenge that is not going to go away if Hamas is in control. We have to hope that Hamas will be destroyed. They are a murderous, genocidal, nihilistic terrorist organization. We pray that they will be destroyed and that they will no longer be able to subvert UN agencies.
Zooming out a little, the larger picture over here, Hillel. At the end of the day, where and how does UN Watch really look at a solution to this entire conflict, to this entire crisis? Is two-state solution the way forward?
Well, look, the problem with UNRWA is that the international community said there must be a Palestinian state. Okay, we tried to figure that out in Gaza. Israel withdrew completely. They had control of it. They turned it into a terror state. The West Bank, Israel pulled out of all the main cities, Ramallah, Jenin, Hebron, Nablus, and so forth. Terrorists are also entering there, those connected to Fatah, known as the Lion's Den in Jenin. But UNRWA says that it's not enough. You have to give us Israel as well. The Palestinians from 75 years ago are all going to return. In India, in South Asia, you had exchange of population. And no one is saying 75 years later, everyone is going to start upending countries and people going back and forth. So this notion is absurd. The way we'll get peace is for the Palestinians to recognize that there is legitimacy for a Jewish state. Right now, they think it is not legitimate.
There is a hostage crisis. There's also a humanitarian crisis in Gaza. How can then organizations, international community really look at bringing about peace? Can there be peace? Can there be some sort of normalcy in or between Israel and Palestine?
Peace can come, and it will come when there is recognition by the Palestinians that it is legitimate for Jews to have a state in their ancient ancestral homeland. The United Arab Emirates recognize this. There's peace. Egypt and Jordan, there's peace agreements. Same with Bahrain and Morocco. So Arab states who've recognized the legitimacy of a Jewish state have full peace agreements. The Palestinians refuse to recognize the legitimacy of a Jewish state anywhere. Until that happens, sadly, we will not see peace.
Hillel Neuer, thank you so much for joining us here on India Today.
Thank you.